Mahmoud Fernando bringing you the news in detail.
The news headlines on Gold FM.
In your news headlines, Vance leaves Pakistan after hours of failed talks with Iran. Iran says no to excessive demands from US. PUCSL to exclude unjustified costs from future electricity tariff adjustments. ADB calls for implementation of durable structural revenue measures.
The top story on Gold FM.
US Vice President J.D. Vance left Pakistan this morning after failed peace talks with Iran. Since last evening, both sides have held talks for 21 hours before being concluded this morning. Both countries offered different reasons for the failures of the talks. Addressing the media in Islamabad, the US Vice President said Iran chose not to accept their terms.
We've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on, and we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Vance said that they made their stance clear with regard to Iran's nuclear program.
We need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will.
When quizzed about discussions on unfreezing Iran's assets, this is what the US Vice President had to say.
We talked about all those issues, Jen, and we talked about a number of issues beyond that, and so certainly those things came up, but again, we just could not get to a situation where the Iranians were willing to accept our term.
According to Iranian state media, meanwhile, unreasonable demands from the US frustrated talks to end the war. In a next message, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Baqi said that the success of this diplomatic process depends on the seriousness and good faith of the opposing side, refraining from excessive demands and unlawful requests, and the acceptance of Iran's legitimate rights and interests. In the meantime, US President Donald Trump reaffirmed that they have already won the war despite the outcomes of these negotiations.
We're getting a lot of reports. They've been meeting for many hours, as you probably have noticed. We'll see what happens. Look, regardless, we win. Regardless what happens, we win. We've totally defeated that country. And so let's see what happens. Maybe they make a deal, maybe they don't. From the standpoint of America, we win. One other thing that's happening is that boats are sailing up and heading out to our country. Big, beautiful tankers, and we're loading them up with oil and gas and everything else, and it's a pretty beautiful thing to see.
When quizzed about reports on China supplying weapons to Iran, this is what he had to say.
Well, if China does that, China's going to have big problems, okay?
Meanwhile, former US National Security Advisor John Bolton was critical of Trump sending Vance for peace talks. According to him, Trump committed a mistake.
I think it's a mistake to send the vice president. I think that's too close to the president himself. He's part of the White House. I think the Secretary of State would have been a better choice. But Iran specifically asked for J.D. Vance, and that is a big problem. You don't let your adversary pick your negotiation team. But they picked him clearly because if you read the leaks in the American press, Vance was an opponent of this war. And so I think the spotlight will be on him. You're quite correct. He doesn't have experience in these kinds of negotiations. He's got presumably some kind of instructions from Trump, but who knows how specific they are. So we'll see what happens. I don't anticipate, even though the ceasefire really is not effective at this point, the Strait of Hormuz is still basically closed. I don't expect any change, though, until they actually do meet on Saturday, if that.
Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the United States military command that oversees the Middle East said that 2 of its ships have traveled through the Strait of Hormuz. However, Iran denied such claims. The Israel Defense Forces in the meantime said it struck a rocket launcher that was positioned and ready to launch towards Israel in southern Lebanon. These attacks come against a backdrop where Israel and Lebanon are set to hold their own talks in Washington next week.
This is the local news on Gold FM.
The Public Utilities Commission decided that only reasonable costs related to the generation, transmission and distribution of electricity will influence tariff adjustments. This decision ensures that expenses stemming from coal quality issues or other unjustified costs remain outside the scope of consumer pricing. The Commission previously rejected additional costs linked to coal quality and other unreasonable expenditures during the last tariff review. Following a unanimous decision, the PUCSL confirmed that any such unfair expenses will continue to be excluded from all upcoming electricity tariff revisions. The government must ensure that durable structural revenue measures are in place to continue the gains achieved last year. This is the view of the Asian Development Bank during the launch of the Asian Development Outlook April 2026 in Colombo. Speaking to the media, Lakshmi Fernando, Principal Economics Officer of the regional lender, highlighted a number of issues related to the Sri Lankan economy. One such was tourist arrivals. According to the central bank data, the first 3 months of the year saw the arrival of 740,634, an increase compared to same period last year, which is 722,276. However, this year's March figure was 183,979, some 37,000 reduction compared to March last year, which is 229,298. If the war continues, Fernandez said that figures will continue to decline in the coming months.
If you look at the March numbers, March 26 compared to 2025, arrivals fell 20%. It reached about 184,000, again not meeting the government's targets. But what you see is even though the Middle East tourists don't account for a large percentage, it is those who use the Gulf airspaces as their last point of departure to come to Sri Lanka that are really affecting. So given that airspaces in Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi and Sharjah were closed for quite some time, this impact is an early sign, and we do expect this to deteriorate further in the next couple of months. Of course, the good thing is we are going into the off-season period, so that may help a little. But from about May, June onwards, you see the early bookings for the winter season coming up. And a couple of factors, right? You've got high airline prices now, you've got global uncertainty, you've got escalation of prices, which will all factor into tourist arrivals for this year. So this is an area that we are keeping an eye out on as well. So overall, I think over the winter season, we may see some declines coming in unless the situation is not as prolonged as we anticipate.
Foreign remittances in March, despite the war, was recorded at $254 million, an increase from $205 million compared to the same period last year. $2.29 billion were recorded in the first 3 months, a surge from $1.8 billion compared to the corresponding period last year. However, ADB forecasts a slowdown in the near future.
What we will keep an eye out on is if there is a further slowdown in remittances, although remittances have done well this year so far, given that we're going into a period of interest repayments coming up following the debt restructuring, any sort of slowdown in forex inflows could impact our reserve numbers here.
The ADB's principal economics officer then highlighted the necessity of sustaining the revenue growth achieved last year.
Last year we saw revenue was exceedingly high and it beat all expectations, but it's important to also understand the part vehicle imports played in this. And that's just a one-off revenue gain there. And this year, it's important that the government also looks at a more durable structural revenue measure in order to ensure that administratively there are strong methods to sort of continue this great performance that the government has actually taken. And again, I'd just like to emphasize that the delays in structural reform, implementation, and any sort of fatigue in policy implementation is something that the country cannot afford at this point of time. We also need to ensure that we don't undermine private sector investments at this point. The government has to show the confidence and to ensure that that investment-led growth is there and remains to support Sri Lanka at this juncture.
Large crowds continue to gather at the Bastian Ma, the private bus stand, Peta Central Bus Stand, Markubur Multimodal Transport Centre and Fort Railway Station as people travel to their hometowns for the new year. The Railway Department announced special train services for the return journey, including additional deployments on the coastal line. Meanwhile, police arrested a 33-year-old Kalani resident over allegations of damaging and stealing property from the newly renovated Peta Central Bus Stand. Police said that a portion of the stolen items was recovered from the suspect's possession. He was remanded until the 17th of April after being produced in the court. In a separate operation, National Transport Commission officials seized 7 buses at People's Park over allegations of transporting passengers to Hatton, Navalapitiya and Diagama without valid permits.
Now for some news in brief.
Five individuals died following several road incidents across the island within the past 24 hours.
The business news on Gold FM.
Analysts predict the global oil market will plunge into a supply deficit this year as the war in Iran erases previous forecasts of oversupply. A Reuters poll of 8 experts suggests demand will outpace supply by an average of 750,000 barrels per day throughout 2026. The conflict, which began in February, effectively halted flows through the Strait of Hormuz, a vital passage for 1/5 of global oil consumption. The International Energy Agency reports that the war removed roughly 11 million barrels per day from the market by late March. While a ceasefire began on Tuesday, tankers remain stranded in the Gulf with an estimated 136 million barrels of crude stuck in transit. Experts warn that clearing this backlog faces significant hurdles, including high insurance risks and potential new transit fees imposed by Iran.
International news on Gold FM.
Cyclone Vayanu made landfall on New Zealand's North Island today, bringing life-threatening winds exceeding 130 km per hour. The storm triggered widespread power outages for thousands of homes and forced the mandatory evacuation of hundreds of residents, particularly in the Wakatane district. The country's emergency management minister noted that while the storm tracked further east than initially feared, significant risks from coastal inundation remain due to high tides and 6-meter swells. The New Zealand Defence Force is currently assisting with emergency operations across the region. Air New Zealand cancelled over 90 regional flights, though international services continue with delays.
Entertainment news on Gold FM.
The stage adaptation of Paddington Bear and the musical Into the Woods lead the nominations at Britain's top theatre honours today. Several high-profile Hollywood actors contend for individual prizes, including Oscar winner Cate Blanchett and Loki star Tom Hiddleston. Breaking Bad actor Bryan Cranston and Snow White lead Rachel Segler, who also features in the running for their acclaimed performances on the London stage.
Sports news on Gold FM.
It is reported that fast bowler Matisha Pathirana cleared his fitness assessments today. This development clears the way for Sri Lanka Cricket to issue the necessary no objection certificate. Pathirana now prepares to join the Kolkata Knight Riders squad for the current IPL season.